We're going to talk about environmental sustainability. I'm really excited that the Elevate team is thinking about sustainability from the beginning. Most businesses, most new modes of transportation don't get that opportunity. And I'm very honored to be joined by a panel of experts to help guide us through framing that conversation, because I think the answer is we don't have all the answers, but we know what some of the good questions are, and we have experience from working with other modes and electrifying other modes and thinking about how we've gotten it right in the past. Let me do a first quick round of introductions for our panelists. I'll lay out a few basic concepts so I can set the table for our conversation. We'll dive right into it. We have 35 minutes together, so this is going to feel a little quick. We do have Slido active, so if you have access to the Slido app, put a few questions on there, vote some other people's questions. We'll take the top voted questions at some point in the conversation, about the last 10 minutes or so. Does that make sense? So first, a round of applause. Offering views from Cities and Environmentalists, we have Melanie who leads Nutter Consulting, which is a firm that works with civic and business sector clients to help realize their ambitions towards urban sustainability and smart cities. Melanie. To help us think about the concept of creating double bottom line impact and value, we have Pasquale Romano, who's CEO of ChargePoint and president. You might have caught him on the stage yesterday. Thanks for being here, Pat. To help us think about how product design elements are a characteristic of how we might think about sustainability and its influences on this product, Jeff Salazar leads the customer experience design practice in North America for McKinsey. Jeff. And finally, to bring the technical expertise of how we can employ technology to support value add for customers and help get more customers into products at the same time, Rob Dearborn is a data scientist on Uber strategy and planning team, focusing on developing the company's strategies for pricing, matching, and low-cost products. Thanks for being here, Rob. A few contextual comments. The way we get from A to B today is fundamentally unsustainable. Nobody knows this better than mayors and city officials around this country, around cities all over the world. Let me lay out the reality that they face. Between now and 2050, so the next 3 decades, we expect population to grow about 30%. We'll move from 7 billion people today or so to 10 billion people. We expect aggressive urbanization. About half of us live in cities now. About 2/3 are expected to live in cities by 2050. And mobility demand, in the business as usual case, is expected to grow 300%. From the miles that we consume today, 3 times more we are expected to consume by 2050. At the same time, the environmental community, the risk assessment community, is fairly certain that unless the transportation sector reduces its impact by about 60%, let's take just a carbon basis, so about 60% carbon reduction from the transportation sector, we won't move the transportation sector to its ability to contribute to things like the Paris Climate Agreement's 2-degree world scenarios. In most developed cities today, transportation is responsible for about half of the carbon footprint of a city, and generally more than half of local criteria pollutants, oxides of nitrogen, particulate matter, can be as much as 90% in some cities. So this is a real hard problem, and of course the answer for the last 100 years has been the personal combustion car. It has been the preferred tool of all of us for the last 100 years. Just to give you an image of what that is, in the 35 most developed countries in the world, the OECD countries, we drive about 11 trillion miles a year. We move about 11 trillion miles a year. 80% of that is in a car. 80%. Just for reference, here in the United States, 2% of all trips are done by transit. Half of those are completed in New York City. It's absolutely clear that cities need to approach this dual challenge of providing mobility and meeting the environmental capacity that they have around them for the next 30 years with very different tools than they've used for the last 100 years. It's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So how do we address these dual challenges that cities face? So, Melanie, I wonder if you could help kick us off Among your many achievements, I think you're our only panelist who actually has, you've reduced carbon. You have a number, you reduced carbon for the city of San Francisco by 14.5% from 1990 levels. Well done to you. Thank you for that. You work with the city's Department of the Environment. You're working with cities today to help them meet their sustainability goals.
Thank you to Adam. Thank you to Uber. It's really great to be here. This is my passion, is really focusing on how cities can achieve sustainability and equity goals. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation today about the role that Uber is playing in particular, and that urban aviation will play, hopefully, in the future of advancing sustainability goals. So I wanted to mention that some of the problems that we're facing, I think, were laid out very clearly. The city of Los Angeles, in particular, has 2 additional problems that I wanted to highlight to bring it local. Sea level rise is something, of course, that a lot of cities are facing from climate change, and there's a prediction right now that the city of Los Angeles will have about a 5-foot sea level rise by 2100. So that's another challenge that a city like Los Angeles is facing. But more particularly, we all know that a city like Los Angeles has serious congestion problems. A recent report was just done saying that the average individual in Los Angeles sits in traffic for about 100 hours a year, which is equal to about 2 weeks of vacation. So we know that single occupancy vehicle trips are a cause of a lot of challenges for individuals as well as for cities. So yes, it's true. Cities are looking for new answers. And that's why I think there's been a really great innovation and mobilization, a revolution in cities with new mobility, with ride-sharing, car sharing, bike sharing, scooter sharing, all of these new mobility options that are now helping to supplement and support public transit systems. But in order for us to do things like reduce carbon emissions by 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, we need that many more options. So I think one of the things we'll likely talk about is this future that we've all heard about, shared, electric, and autonomous, and what is that going to look like in our cities, and how are we going to get there?
So let's pick up on that. It's hard to go to a mobility conference these days, not hear both experts, researchers say you've got to do shared, electric, and autonomous in order to meet some of these goals. The electric piece we were pretty certain about at least 20 years ago. Everybody said we got to decarbonize transportation. EVs, electrifying transportation, one of the only tools that we have. This is a tough problem, and it requires a lot of private sector innovation and private sector to step into that. Pat, you've had more than 25 years of experience in the technology industry, leading companies, helping them both grow and scale, and taking on what otherwise is a tough challenge for companies, which is growing their business and in a way that has real impact. Do you think that there's a natural opportunity here for businesses to both think about sustainability and meeting these mobility challenges? You haven't been scared before. You don't seem scared now. What's driving you forward?
So, a great way to tee that up. One of the ways that I think about sustainability is that it was a lot like when you were a little kid and your mom told you to eat your peas and you didn't, so you tried to minimize how many you ate because you just really didn't want to do it. And so becoming, having a less environmentally impactful transportation network is akin to eating your peas, meaning it's less convenient, it's more costly, right? It doesn't economically or beneficially align with you. Not a really good strategy. So here's the good news. Electrification aligns perfectly. And the reason is if you raise the utilization of a vehicle, it immediately pencils. I don't know if many of you know the stats, but the cars that we all own, those cars are utilized 4% of the time, which means 96% of the time it could be a cardboard cutout sitting in the parking lot. It wouldn't matter because you wouldn't know it. And so when you electrify that drivetrain, the differential in its cost structure to you is only apparent 4% of the time. 96% of the time, it's just sitting there. And so a fleet vehicle, a transit vehicle, et cetera, as we fleetify the world, right, as we start to share things instead of own them ourselves, the utilization goes up. So now you start to think about platform life. So an electric drive platform will last 500,000 miles. For all of us, we're going to get tired of that car before we put 500,000 miles on it. So that doesn't really help us, right? The electrification is dramatically cheaper fuel-wise and maintenance-wise. And if you're going to use that vehicle 30, 40, 50% of the hours in a day, 24/7, 365, it's going to have an enormous impact on the cost structure. And so when we add autonomy to that, well, then we remove the cost of the driver. So we're going to start dropping the cost of transportation, which means that people are going to want to use it. People already like Uber, right? And it's because they can conveniently book a trip, and it's automatically paid for, and they don't have to think about it, and it shows up when I want to use it. Now imagine, as we were talking offline, concatenating that with transit, giving me more choice and cost options, dropping the overall cost. I might not own 2 cars anymore. I might just cut down to 1. I might cut down to 0. So I think this is how, you know, it actually works, is align that cost structure, make sustainability the side effect that naturally happens with good business. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be focused on it, but just make it a natural side effect, and poof, it happens.
I think this concept of utilization, right sizing is a really important one that we'll want to pick up on. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit from the efficiency side to pick up with there. Just so we can bring Jeff and Rob into this mix, when experts talk about shared electric and autonomous, this is particularly true in UC Davis's research, the shared piece is the most critical one. Without the sharing, you can't get a dramatic reduction in the vehicle population that's helping more people move. But it's also the hardest one because it requires consumer behavioral shift. After 100 years of driving by ourselves, we just don't like riding with other people, especially here in the United States. We have a hard time sharing. So I'm hoping, Jeff and Rob, you can help us with this question. So Jeff, to say a little bit more about how, Jeff, you focus a lot on design and how through better design we can have great products. You've received numerous awards actually for your designs touching on electric scooters, surgical robots, and my favorite, a great toothbrush a couple of years ago for Oral-B. So how can great design help us get more people into products at the same time?
The small things can make a big difference sometimes. Well, the behavior change piece is really hard. But think about those moments when you've done that, when you've tried that, when you've succeeded, when you've failed. What is it that moves the needle there? Like, how many people here drive an electric car? Wow, not a lot, real small percentage. We all know the benefits. We are all, at least conceptually, understand there's some benefit there. So there's definitely some hurdles. And I'd love to have a conversation with each of you about your experience, because I bet it's got lots of pros and cons. And one of the things to think about in behavior change is, you know, we were just talking about this outside, is what have we learned from the past, right? So, you know, Uber's been launched for quite a while. One of the things that became pretty immediately understood is it's addressing only part of the market, only part of the use scenarios of how people move throughout the world. One of the challenges in that puzzle is the fixed asset of the automobile has been designed a particular way, and it's fairly inflexible. And so we have this challenge of kind of deploying this fleet and looking to get like massive utilization to capture the most scenarios possible, yet this fixed asset won't really help us. So we got to look at it in a holistic way in really helping move the system. I think the other interesting thing about that is how can we then start to anticipate what might be pain points that we may not understand right now? This is hugely challenging. We're trying to predict the future. There's a great little exhibit here. A bunch of design students are painting this aspiration for how this ideal user experience will be. And I love to be part of that. I love to get people excited about the future. But fundamentally, we have to understand what's it going to take to get people there. And in reality, I feel part of the answer is having an adaptable system, right? That really is listening, right? So let's take our best guess out of the gate, but let's understand what we're learning, and let's tweak the system accordingly. And we know there are components of that system that are easier to tweak than others, right? Policy, challenging. Long lead times. Fixed assets, challenging, long lead times, unless we think about kind of manufacturing and production and kind of building differently to allow for those things to happen. So I think if we're being kind of intelligent about what we've learned in the past, we think about deploying systems that are adaptable, we'll be able to understand and be thoughtful about humans as they navigate changing behavior as well, as opposed to just trying to give them one system to transact with, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So I think the evolution of how we create the relationship with consumers is absolutely critical.
So both systems level thinking and asset utilization, big themes here, and we'll probably want to pick up on those. Rob, I want to make sure to get you in here. Your professional experience has a lot of themes around strategy, efficiency, and working with or against gravity. You did some work for the NFL. You even taught kids how to ski downhill. That's where the gravity comes in. And so it could be very useful for this eVTOL case. But at Uber, we're trying to work on getting more people to pool together, which is a hard enough problem. We've been successful. About 20% in towns where we offer pool, 20% of riders choose that. That's double the American average for carpooling. So there seems to be a technological role in delivering better products to get people to do what they otherwise don't tend to do. What's been your experience?
Yeah. So I love that one of the central themes of this discussion and one of the premises of this panel is that shared rides and unlocking not just shared rides, but electric, autonomous, shared, multimodal. I'll throw that last one in, which we haven't talked about yet, but we at Uber think it's going to be pretty important. But the key to making this work and work in a way that anybody wants to use it it's been my personal belief, and I think it's our team's belief at Uber, is fundamentally a design problem. And we mean that both in the traditional sense of designing a consumer product and designing the product that the user, in our case, the Uber rider or Uber driver, interacts with and is aware of, in terms of the information architecture and making sure that when you choose a shared ride, your expectations for what you're getting into are well set. You understand that number one, that you understand why this person's sitting next to you in the car, which is actually somewhat hard to convey. You understand why you're being asked to walk. You understand what all the benefits of this are, which is a lower cost ride for you. But in some cases, in the case of walking, we found when we've added a batching window up front so that we hold you a little bit to make a little bit to make a much better quality match. We found we can actually get you from point A to point B faster than in the absence of those decisions. So, in one sense, it's communicating all that information and making sure that the user understands it and values it. But it's also a design problem in a broader sense in terms of a lot of the magic that's happening on the back end that the user, or most users at least, are never aware of, but are every bit as important as the front end experience. And for us, that's the enormously hard problem that we've been working on for 3 years now, and we'll continue to work on forever and always improve. Of how do we match riders in a city who are each looking to go from their own personal point A to personal point B together in such a way that we can that you can share the costs and share the emissions and share the ride across multiple riders at the same time. But it's also, in addition to back-end design, it's also good policy design and good urban design in terms of cities and in terms of our advocating for that with cities and our relationship with regulators and governments and electorates. So I think, in addition to the product design challenges we face, I think it's also, we've realized, super important to making our product succeed, that we advocate for policy decisions which make shared rides relatively valuable compared to alternative transportation modes or transportation choices. That we're doing things, like solo rides are costly. They have a cost. They're arguably selfish. Like, cities need to make sure that riders in their city and travelers in their city have properly internalized that cost so that it's not just this free rider problem that exists, that they're actually bearing it and they're actually making a decision, a rational decision on the basis of that. We need to incent and make good decisions about like the physical, actual construction and design of our cities in terms of like advocating for shared bike lanes and shared vehicle lanes and advocating for, let's put a park here instead of a parking structure and actually fund it with that congestion or tax we talked about earlier.
Right, it's almost where the product can only go so far. We can only design so much, where at some point we need the policy and environmental systems level to be thoughtful about how everything fits in. So let's pick up on this sort of systems level thinking and asset utilization. Today, when people buy a car, they buy it for that one use case where they're like, boy, I'll probably pull the boat I don't own up to the mountains. I'm going to need that Hemi truck, and I'll use that for all my normal driving, and then I may use it for that one trip that I'm imagining I will never do. And we have all these different consumers making that same individual calculus, buying an expensive asset, never using it, and we end up with a system full of emptiness, basically. So how does moving towards, and with eVTOL, we're thinking of designing this differently from the beginning, but that's hard, although we don't have these legacy issues of the private car. So how do you see what's working to move people out of cars today, or the idea that they might not have to make that individual consumer decision, or that they might be able to save some money? It doesn't just happen overnight. What are you seeing in your respective industries that's working, getting people out of those normal behaviors?
Well, I'll just start with, I think both points that you made are great ones around urban design and policy and the role that cities can really play to support this development. Two specific examples I wanted to give is we just finished a report working with Salida Reynolds and the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, and finished a report that's called the Los Angeles Shared Mobility Climate and Equity Action Plan. And so it's really looking at what are the levers that the city government in particular can pull to do exactly that, to inspire, incentivize, or disincentivize single occupancy vehicles and ownership. So two examples in particular, and a broad strategy that we recommended is really to share or to manage local city assets for shared mobility, biking, walking, transit, and not the private vehicle. As we know, most of our cities over the past 50 to 75 years have been designed particularly around the car. And so that's a really huge shift in cities where city governments, forward-thinking leaders like Salida are saying we've got to manage it differently so that a lot of these services can thrive. So that's one. Two is looking at some policies like, for instance, congestion pricing, which can be controversial, but a lot of cities are really looking at what sort of price signals can they send to say, it's actually going to be a little bit more expensive for you to bring your individual car downtown. Think about another option. Think about a bike, a ride share, a car share, public transit, and using those types of levers to inspire the right behavior.
This very much gets at this fleetification thing that you raised, Pat. Yeah. How much does the fleetification improve the business case on your end? I imagine if you start utilizing the assets more individually, there's an asset utilization case on the infrastructure side as well.
Yeah, so the way we think about that is that right now, I can't believe I'm saying this, in the legacy world of electric vehicles, not that there's much of a legacy, but if you take, so if you take what I mean by that is you take, right now most of the infrastructure we're putting in is addressing cars that are owned by people that are not using them much. Right. And if you fleetify the world, which we believe is going to happen, so right now our business is attached to the number of cars sold into a geography. And our business becomes attached to vehicle miles traveled. And if you add goods to that, it's just vehicle miles traveled, but transporting people or goods. That's a great thing, because when it goes autonomous, or even when it's not autonomous and someone else is driving, because when you use an Uber now, it's actually autonomous drive because you're not driving. It's just not as cheap as it will be when there's not a driver in place. You recover that time, so you will become less sensitive to travel time, not to an extreme degree, but you will become less sensitive. So going to San Francisco from where I live for dinner on a weekend because I don't have to drive home is a possibility with an Uber, but it's not a possibility if I have to drive my own car 50 miles each way.
That's right. And it's exciting to think about this world of miles traveled.
Right. So miles traveled so when you concentrate around fleet depots, it becomes a fleet charging problem. And then our business becomes much more attached with the volume of energy and the number of charging sessions, less so the number of vehicles, because you're concentrating the number of vehicles, but the miles traveled may actually rise.
Right.
So we actually love it. We actually think it's awesome, and I think it's good for everybody. It's good for it's good for everyone's economics.
So we should talk about that, because any environmentalist or urban planner in the room has used VMT as one of their canaries in the coal mine for, oh my goodness, my city's headed towards unsustainable territory. VMT becomes a proxy for things that we don't like, for emissions, for sprawl, for congestion. So how do we change that conversation? How should we be thinking about VMT? I get the impression that not all VMT are equal. And as we think about how people need mobility for economic mobility, most importantly. So how do we solve this dual challenge, unlocking VMT that's good, healthy VMT that enables more people to move, while tamping down on VMT that isn't as helpful and not as productive on the business side?
So I'm going to spin this again to the behavior change piece, because it's a bit more in the zone of how I think about the world. It's hard to apply a formula, because and you even just mentioned it in the conversation. Like, there's a full range of how, like, people's relationship to why they drive, what's their relationship to their car. We did a study, about 2,000 people, and we gave them an option to trade in their car or get free Uber rides. Right, or the equivalent, free Uber rides, to get that. And there was about half the people that said, no, I need my car. And then there was about half the people that said, wow, that's pretty interesting. And the fascinating piece was really, who were the people that said it was interesting? And it became more interesting to the folks higher up the economic ladder. So all of a sudden you say, wow, you can't really address this with one answer. I think being really thoughtful about the full range of kind of where people are entering the system, their relationship to it is broad. And I think it inherently, it causes you to ask different questions in different situations that fundamentally will lead you, I think, to different answers. Yeah. It's not necessarily the least complex way to go about it, but I think it's absolutely human. And I think it's one of the challenges we've had for why we haven't moved the needle in this, because I think we've been trying to apply one particular system or a couple of systems that are, very complex and very costly. And I think it's missing some of these components of really understanding the breadth of kind of the human condition in this way.
In many cases, buying a personal car has been a perfectly, and still is, the perfectly rational decision for most families. And we have this interesting challenge here, particularly in the West Coast, where when cities find economic success, they gentrify their old areas. Lower income folks then are forced to live further and further out. They're now moving to exurbs, even rural areas. How do we think about this VMT conversation? And there's a question on Slido, are we building something that's relevant for rural areas? How does eVTOL, how does some of the shared autonomous electric future address some of the needs of the exurbs and suburbs? How do we think about them? Because for a while, their best option is going to be buying that personal car. Let's start with Melanie. I wonder if I could turn to you, because this is an interesting problem here in the greater LA region. You just did some consulting work for LA. They've got a lot of exurbs, a lot of suburban areas. This is also the city that's partnering with us for eVTOL, because they're a polycentric city. There might be some unique options that eVTOL can unlock for them. How are they thinking about incorporating new solutions for the exurbs and rural areas?
So I will tell you that this is a really interesting area and a really important thing to address. I think a lot of urban areas forget about rural areas. There's not a very strong rural-urban connection in our country, and more cities are starting to ask, just now, what is our responsibility to interact and support and be connected to rural communities? So it's definitely a new discussion. I would say, from thinking about what the opportunity is for something like urban aviation, I think there's really interesting opportunities to think about opening up new economic opportunities for folks that either have chosen to live in rural areas or have been pushed out of our center cores. But I do think that cities still have a responsibility for serving and supporting the underserved in cities that still live there, Again, just to toot the horn of Los Angeles, they just launched a great program called Blue LA, which is electric vehicle car sharing for underserved communities. And the pods have been placed in traditionally underserved neighborhoods. So I think it's not an either-or question. I think the question is, how can we bridge the gap between urban and rural, but also continue to serve underserved populations in cities?
It makes a lot of sense. I want to make sure that we get to the Slido, because by my watch, we're soon to leave this session, but up on our clock it says we've got 23 minutes left. Can anybody clarify when we're supposed to wrap up? Because I want to be very respectful of the audience's time. I was told till 1:35. Anyone? I'm going to keep following this clock unless anybody gets me a better answer. It's 1:34 at the moment. We'll carry on here for a second until somebody officially gives us the hand signal. The next one's up at 2. Okay. Fortunately, you've got a captive set of panelists here for the next 20 minutes, I think, so we'll go with that for now. The question at the top of the Slido was the next one after the rural question was, why on earth is Uber talking about sustainability at all? Which is an interesting one to raise. Of course, the answer is to give me a job, which is a really important one. But I wanted to turn this to Pat first, because I think you've built businesses that have embedded sustainability into their core from the beginning, and I wonder how you might reframe that question or address it generally.
Well, it's kind of what I said in the first remark. You build it in as a side effect of a good business. You can't make something economically work at scale that doesn't. If sustainability doesn't economically work at scale, it won't happen. And so I want to flip this around a little bit. Here's what I worry about the most. We're disrupting. This is not disrupting a small niche industry. This is not like, a new kind of blade server that no one cares about, right? Where, you're only disrupting, a small number of people in a small industry. You're completely reshaping the automobile industry. You're completely shrinking the fuel industry by a huge amount, okay? There's so many things that are, you're completely removing drivers over time. So yes, it's all going to be better because we are dropping the cost of transportation, which is built into everything we buy. So we're improving the cost of living and we're getting time recovery for everybody. But there's going to be a tremendous amount of resistance because think about how big the industries I just articulated are. And that's not to mention insurance and all the other knock-on industries that are kind of peripherally engaged in this. So the bigger issue is that sustainability isn't aligned with the rate at which it can change is being throttled by the number of individuals that are in industries that are going to get massively disrupted.
Yep.
And that's the big issue that no one wants to talk about. You don't need 50 auto OEMs worldwide. You probably don't even need 10 in this universe, right? When it's all autonomous and it's all fleetified, right? The vertical integration is going to delaminate into a different landscape there. So that's the bigger issue. It's all going to be great from a sustainability perspective. And on the VMT issue, I don't see why we want to drive it down. If all the energy is made cleanly and we reduce traffic because we use machine learning algorithms to pre-position cars and make sure rural people have access and suburban people have access, use it as much as you want. Transport yourself wherever you want. Right. If it's cheap and easy and clean and you're not hurting anything, have a great life. But the problem is, on the way there are a bunch of industries that are going to, be in ashes.
I think the point that I'm hearing most is that efficiency is the disruptor here.
Yeah.
And we have legacy issues of leaving a very inefficient way of moving people from A to B. And that efficiency is what's driving that disruption. And there will be some inertia. And difficult to get to escape velocity to get out of that last legacy. Rob, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we think about efficiency from just the basics of getting more people into fewer cars, because we're very constrained on the supply side. That's probably not going to change anytime in the near future. But it's a hard thing to do, and unless we can efficiently get more people miles out of vehicle miles, we won't be a successful business.
Yeah. So the question is, why should Uber care about sustainability? And the first reason why is because it's the right thing to do. But the second reason why, and the premise of this question is that Uber wants to grow its value and get profitable, and what's implicit in that is that sustainability doesn't help with that. And that's just not true at all. And so I think, if you look at the history of Uber, we exist where we exist today because we took a transportation technology that was fundamentally broken, which is taxis, and we improved it and we scaled that. And at the same time, though, if we were to continue scaling that and continue scaling it at the scales that we're talking about here, which is entirely replacing car ownership, the numbers just wouldn't add up for anybody. The cost wouldn't be low enough for anybody to actually do it personally, economically. The cost would be enormous from an environmental or congestion standpoint, and so those numbers just don't add up. What numbers do add up are the numbers which are the path to our future growth, which I think is very much aligned with the path toward vibrant, beautiful, well-functioning cities, at least relative to where they are today, which is shared rides and efficient rides and pooled, high-capacity rides. And so I think that is the path by which, number one, we can actually reduce costs so that we grow and so that people can actually feasibly start to replace their vehicles with ride-sharing networks, slowly but surely. But it's also the path by which, in the process of doing so, we're physically able to actually, get from point A to point B because it's not entirely congested. And it's the path by which, we can do that also in a way that Uber makes a buck or two and is sustainable itself along the way. And so I think, what's the premise of this question is just not right, that instead, everybody's incentives, riders as our customers, cities as our customers, and Uber as a business that wants to operate, grow, be sustainable, be profitable, are exactly aligned here, and that the way you do that for everybody is shared rides.
It sounds like, and Pat, I think this has been your experience, and you've got some good record of experience in this regard, making more efficient businesses are the natural winners in those ecosystems of leaving these inefficient vestiges. So let's move beyond, talking about the personal private car world where we've been for a while. Let's talk about eVTOL a bit, because this is interesting that the new mode wants to design itself as pooled and shared and pooled, electric, and potentially then autonomous from the start. That's exciting. And Jeff, I wonder if you could comment on what that opens up from the design perspective. If anything, we'd love for the car world to start learning from this emerging eVTOL world that's trying to get it right from the start.
Yeah, well, it goes back to what I was saying before about the adaptable system, because some of this we just don't know yet. And so how is the system being built to adapt? Again, I don't need to repeat that there, but I do think that's really critical. You can look back even a number of years, and you would just marvel at where we're at today in ways you couldn't have predicted it. We're really bad at predicting. And so I think that's a challenge. I do, want to go back and think about the behavior piece again, because I fundamentally believe that we've got a lot of ingenuity as human beings. And even though I may have this a hurdle in my mind about travel in the air, I do have a relationship to it already, right? Most of us, well, at least I did. I came here today with a bunch of strangers in a tin can. And I did that without really thinking about it. But when I think about leaving my car and going with a bunch of strangers, it's completely backwards, right? It feels unnatural. So I'll keep using the word, I think Uber's got an opportunity to change people's relationship to this new world. And I think that's a responsibility that Uber, frankly, has in this way. And I think that part of it is be with us along the way, right? There is this collective movement to be in a better place and to be part of the system, to contribute to the system and to receive from the system. And I think it may sound a bit abstract, but I do think that's how ecosystems work fundamentally. And again, we can look back at what we've learned to date, but we can also just pay attention to how the planet works. how it's communicating with us, how do we respond to it in that way. So I don't mean to get so macro on this, but I do think it's a really important way to consider what potential solutions could look like.
Well, Pat, I wonder if you could comment on what you've seen work in the EV world. For a long time, the game, and it still is part of the game, but just driving awareness of the fact that EVs are a thing and they're unbelievable. And for what's hard for some people to just conceive anything other than what they've been used to, a gas-powered car, gas-powered plane, whatever it might be. But what's worked for your business to show that magic of what electric can do?
Great point, and I think it's related to what you just said. So EV started the wrong way, because Tesla wasn't the first one. I think there's the human you have to start with the human element, and you're the expert in this, so I'm going to embarrass myself probably in front of you by making these comments because I'm not an expert in it. But cars are sort of emotional, aspirational things in the legacy world of owning a vehicle. They're somewhat an expression of who you are because they're personally owned, right? So there's a bit of fashion and personal statement in a vehicle. So start with an aspirational vehicle to give an industry a good impression. So a Tesla Model S, a Tesla Model X, awesome. Start with aspirational, 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. Great performance, innovative interior design with electronic, innovative big screen for the electronics. Start with the aspirational vehicle. It won't serve that big of element of the population, but when you move a tier down, it just validated it. So what we started with, I don't want to offend anyone, but what we started with is not very attractive, kind of weird-looking vehicles because we tried to over-accelerate the descent at price point. And so we created inverse aspiration. We created, oh, I don't want one of those, right? I would never be caught dead in one of those. That's what we got in the beginning of the EV industry. And so we had to undo it. So VTOL represents a way to start from an aspirational thing. Wouldn't it be cool to fly somewhere and have a personal pilot, right? I mean, it's right. Awesome. So it actually is very well aligned with what I hope you're not going to make fun of, the human emotional element of being aspirationally associated with the future.
And this may be what we have to do, because if you're going to be successful, Pat, in moving from a car sales world to a VMT world, a miles traveled world, we can't make the car the sexy thing anymore. The ride has to be the sexy thing. That has to be the magical experience each mile.
Well, I would say, just to pick up on your point around an aspirational vehicle, I think from a sustainability perspective, one of the questions that I've been asking is, and not to offend anybody on the stage, why is electric the answer? Are we thinking of beyond electric? Because right now, as you well know, our electric grid still has its own challenges. In California, about 50% of our electric mix comes from natural gas, so there still are emissions, right? So electrification is way better than having a system that is gas-powered and fossil fuel.
We got our best tech guy on it here. He
test,
says, twist it and push it in more.
Is this working? Great.
That sounds good, actually, yeah?
Thank you. Thanks for the tip.
Well, please.
So just to complete this point is, there is, as many of you may know, a plane, the Solar Impulse 2, that was a solar-powered plane that traveled around the world. And so in this conversation, my question as a sustainability person is, we're starting with electrification because that's what we know today, and that will be much better than anything that's fossil fueled. But how do we keep pushing the envelope on sustainability? What's the next frontier? And will that be baked into some of these first vehicles that are created?
So, Melanie, you make the point that it's just electrification of mobility is just so much better than where we're at with combusting fossil fuels. There are some basic physics involved in this. It's naturally 2 to 3 times more efficient for a lot of different reasons. Pat, we talked yesterday, and we were joking if this question would even come up around electricity. The batteries one did come up. The question is, does building more batteries and then disposing of them, does that create a problem? I've got to bring you in to just bring the line in on batteries and electrification one last time.
So, two quick points. One on your point, electricity is not it's a derivative fuel. You make it from something else. So electrifying the leaf nodes in the tree, which are the most diffuse problem, is what you want to do, because you can over time, clean up the electricity grid because that's very concentrated. So even if you're break even with fossil fuels today, which you're not, you're better, over time it's easier to fix a power plant and turn it into a wind farm or a solar farm and convert it from coal, and suddenly everything downstream from that is clean. So if you electrify it, you've got a fungible fuel. You don't want to go to a fixed fuel in a vehicle. Gasoline's a fixed fuel. Hydrogen is hydrogen is somewhat of an intermediary fuel because you have to make it from something. But it's just as easy to, use electricity as your intermediate fuel. On the batteries, you're going to see recycling, and you're going to see design of cells and packs move in the direction with recycling as the ultimate end for that pack. We're just early in the industry, so we can flag it as an issue, and I think it is something that we need to be concerned with. We want to recycle everything. I mean, almost everything we interact with now that we consume has a recycling angle on it, and I think the metals in the battery are too valuable to ignore the recycling, and the economics, because of that, will push us in that direction.
That's right, and at such small levels of EV penetration today, that those businesses are just evolving on the recycling piece. But the EV is the only car you can buy today that gets cleaner over its life. It's not possible with the combustion vehicle. It's not possible for that car to get cleaner. Let's go to this new top question. Given the high costs at the initial stage, will you face the dilemma where you must target affluent people who prefer paying for more exclusivity over sharing? So this is a one-part do rich people like sharing even less than everybody else question to our consumer behavior guys down at the end. It's also, Pat, to what you're going for earlier. We're just saying let's start with the aspirational piece because there's great both business value in that, but getting at the right product first. So I wonder, Jeff, Rob, if you could help us with this question of affluence sharing. How can we attack that, and where's eVTOL's role in that?
So the first thing I'll say, which I think is in the context of eVTOL, is I again disagree with the premise of the question and don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if eVTOL starts off as something that's unshared. And I suspect that it will, at least very initially when you're talking trips like how can I get from Midtown Manhattan to JFK as quickly as possible, and the type of person that is caring about that might be an executive who wants to make that trip, who is not very price elastic and will pay to make that happen. But I think their willingness to pay is exactly the type of thing that unlocks the technology and the good of the technology to be used by more people at a lower price point in the future. And so I think the very first travelers on eVTOL may pay a high price. They probably won't, because we'll probably subsidize it a little bit to accelerate that along. But I think very quickly, once you get a few more of those people having a good experience, telling their friends to use it, telling their friends to use it, telling their friends to use it, you improve the utilization of the network. And as you improve the utilization of the network, the price of a solo ride can actually be decreased. And then you improve the utilization of the network further, and then you improve it further and further, and then eventually you're at a price point now where more people are participating, and then you turn on shared rides, and the price point can go on even further into this virtuous flywheel cycle. And by the way, that flywheel cycle I just described is exactly the flywheel cycle that we've experienced with ground transportation, with Black Car to UberX to Uber Pool to Express Pool to high-capacity vehicles. You've got to start somewhere, but it's not about where you start, it's where you finish. And I think shared rides, low-cost rides, is very much, going back to the sustainability question further, our end objective, Cities' end objective, because it's how we grow and it's how we do the right thing, and it's how, frankly, we end up with the biggest possible addressable market.
Jeff, you're nodding your head. Can we get solo Lamborghini drivers into one eVTOL?
No, I think Pat hit on the brand that knows how to do this well. There's a couple brands that know how to do this well, which is Drive Desire. It's undeniable. Like we can put numbers and metrics on it, but the allure and the draw to be part of something. The motivations are different in many cases, but fundamentally, when a company like Tesla, even though it had been around for quite a while and it's still fundamentally challenged, its responsibility is to elevate the presence of this topic, of the opportunity, of the aspiration for what it could be, There's still other ways it could be, right? This is just one way it could be, and it works really well in getting attention. It works really well in creating those that social effect, and it works really well in getting, any number of us to spend a decent amount of money on a car that has some challenges, right? This issue about moving towards electric, right, is, how do you overcome that hurdle? This is one way. You create a draw so powerful that those hurdles you have become manageable. You have a different relationship to them now because the benefit overshadows them to some extent. So I think there's a ton of power in, we talked about it, just keep going back to what is the aspiration that we want to get people to see, to feel, to start to hear about, and then start to become part of. And again, it's not going to be broadly accessible to everybody at the onset. I think this is the way we can experience how this has happened over time with new industries.
I want to use our last 3 minutes to ask each of you who you think needs to be on this panel as we evolve this dialogue around sustainability and getting it right from the start with eVTOL. So I'm going to hit that. For those of you that were asking questions about should they be hydrogen-powered eVTOL, HVTOL, or something like that, are we measuring CO2 at Uber? Happy to chat with you after the fact. I'm sure all of our panelists would be interested in some of the questions that you raised. Thank you for raising these. But Melanie, if I could turn it over to you, we'll go down the line. Who else do we need at this table? Just take one suggestion from you. What stakeholder would you ask to be here for this next conversation?
So there's probably no surprise that my suggestion is cities, transportation directors, Department of Public Works, environment directors, city council people, mayors. There's a lot that cities are going to need to understand about this whole new area, and that's going to be a very important outreach and education effort for that community. There's also a lot of decisions that cities are going to need to make around landing zones, skyports, a lot of things that I've heard of the first time today, and I do smart cities work. And so I'm just thinking, the more that you can bring in the city decision makers early on this, the faster that the market will accelerate and the faster that cities will be able to understand what this is and make decisions that will enable it.
Back to that point that Rob was making, that interrelationship between policy and the industry.
Exactly.
Pat, to you, who else should be at this table?
Sources of capital that are likely to either, as a project co-own groups of aircraft and consign them into an Elevate platform, because obviously Uber's not going to source all the capital for all this. And I think that analogy in the real estate segment and who's going to develop, there's a lot of real estate development in a replanned city.
Yep, it's perfect. Jeff, to you.
As designers, we often look outside of industry for inspiration. So without naming any individuals, I'd like to look outside the country first and start to think about drawing in new perspectives into the mix. Where can we learn from other places, both that have succeeded and failed? And then how can we also be inspired at the same time?
Excellent. Looking abroad. To you, Rob?
I think a couple of sets of folks. One, we've talked a lot today about transportation networks, ride sharing of cars and high-capacity vehicles. We've talked about eVTOL, but I think we need to have representation here from some of our partners, in bike sharing, in scooters, in car sharing like GetAround, who we announced a partnership with. Masabi and transit integration. Like, the future of transportation and sustainable transportation is going to be across many modes that are coordinated and in a way that's intelligent, and I think we all need to be at the table to make sure that that happens. And then the last thing I would say is, let's get some folks here from outside the US, because I think the solutions that we design for the Sao Paulos and the Delhis of the world are going to look very different than the solutions we design for Los Angeles and for DC and San Francisco. And let's bring those folks in too.
It's so true. And the last solution we designed, the personal private car, is the aspiration of every up-and-coming middle-class person in the world. And it's a big problem we're learning. So it's really important that we get that right from the start. I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us today. Thank you to Melanie, to Pat, to Jeff, to Rob. And thank